welcome everybody to our Wednesday keynote, which is also the Bloomsday keynote. So it's a very special keynote. And it is my pleasure to introduce Eric Bulson, I should say Professor Eric Bulson. Eric is Professor of English at Claremont Graduate University in California. He has gotten a PhD from Columbia University, and he has developed a wide array of research interests, including, of course, James Joyce, modernism, critical theory, world literature, visual storytelling, that sounds very interesting, and British Anglophone literature. Now, he has published extensively a stunning number of articles and books, and I'm going to mention just 3 monographs. The first is Novels, Maps and Modernity, which he published in 2007 with Routledge. And then I'd like to mention the 2017 Little Magazine Award for a book, again, which he published for Columbia University Press, and his very recent publication book, which came out in December 2020, very particular year, and the title is Ulysses by Numbers, Counting Literature in a Digital World. And I'd like to say that Eric and Trieste go back a long time. I think he came here first on a Fulbright scholarship in 2001, Eric, I cannot guess. And since then he's been coming back to Trieste in different shapes and forms, one of them being as a groom. He got married here. He has presented papers several times at the Joyce School, so it is deeply moved and honored to chair this keynote today, which is entitled Ulysses, the Dataset, or Dataset. Okay, Eric, whenever you're ready, so are we, and it's up to you.
Laura, thank you. Thank you very much, Laura. I guess you have to turn that microphone. There we go. Hi, Laura. Laura, thank you for the really generous introduction. And it's really wonderful to see you and to see John and Ronan here at the top of my screen. And thanks to all of you for chiming in wherever you happen to be around the world. As Laura said, I'm here. I'm actually not on a bridge. I'm actually in Claremont, California, in my back house. We had a power outage on campus, so I had to quickly scramble to figure out where I was going to deliver this talk from, and this is where I've ended up. So before I get started today, too, I want to thank John McCourt, of course, Ronan Crowley, and Catherine for the generous invitation to come and talk to you today about my research. And I guess one thing to mention here is that this talk is actually a year late. I was supposed to be here last June, and obviously the world went upside down and inside out. And in the meantime, amidst everything, my book came out. And so originally I was going to be giving something from the book. And then now a year later, the book is out. And this has actually been a great opportunity for me to reflect a bit about the book that I wrote. And this is always, as many of you know, a time and an opportunity to think perhaps about the things I would do again and the things I might not do. And it's also an opportunity to think about the kind of larger questions that this book raised. So some of you might have had a glance at it so far. Some of you have not. It doesn't matter. I'm really going to try to kind of think about, in just kind of very broad terms, this question of quantitative literary criticism. And of course, I'm going to be talking about numbers and Ulysses. So if the title Ulysses, the data set, once you hear data, if your eyes don't glaze over yet, okay, I know that was the risk that I took, that doesn't sound like the sexiest of titles. But in general terms, before I get started, I really wanted to use this as an opportunity to think about, the future of reading Ulysses, not really as a book, but as a kind of in its digital format, and which is inevitable. It's already happened. It's happening now as we speak. So you're going to see some numbers in this talk, and I apologize for the numerically less inclined. If numbers might turn you off or you won't find interesting. But there's also going to be Jesus Christ, who, whenever you're talking about Joyce, doesn't seem very far off. And then there'll be some dogs in here, which, as we know, Joyce was deathly afraid of. So it's an action-packed. There's a pretty eclectic combination of material. So let me get started. Ulysses is many things. It's a novel, an encyclopedia, an epic of the human body, but it's also a data set. Now, let me share my screen here before I get started. There we go. So Ulysses, the data set. Here I am again. Okay, so this particular term is very much in vogue at the moment. And that's partly because everything in our lives is becoming quantifiable. Our drinking and shopping habits, our workouts and calories, our Google searches and reading patterns. So I'm using the term today to emphasize that as much as Ulysses is and will remain a timeless work of art with qualities that many of us would find unquantifiable, it's also a literary object that can be measured. And the question, of course, is why? Why measure when we've been trained to interpret? In many ways, we already have been measuring Ulysses. But how many guides, indexes, censuses, and directories, for instance, can one book really stand? But what I have in mind here with measurement is perhaps more literal, not just collecting the data in this novel, the biographical, historical, geographical, etc., but actually visualizing and interpreting that data. And think, for example, of Miles Hanley's word index to Ulysses from the late 1930s. That's data. He and his team spent years getting the 29,899 different words organized, but never actually took the time to find out what was there. The American linguist, George Kingsley Ziff, however, did. He used Hanley's index as a data set to study the relationship between word frequency, how many times a word appears in the text, and its rank, the order in which it appears. Ulysses appealed to Ziff in large part because of its size. He had been analyzing the relationship between word frequency and rank using much smaller samples, and he was surprised to discover that even with a data set this large, the results were the same. Frequency and rank were inversely proportional. So the most frequent word occurs twice as often as the second, 3 times as often as the third, and so on. And that's the table right there. Ziff's law has been applied to everything from urban demographics to the structure of the internet. And what's still so striking for anyone who reads his lengthy analysis is the way that he transformed the entire novel into an equation. That's the equation right here. Ulysses equals frequency over 1, frequency over 2, to frequency to the last word. He couldn't care less about what happened in Dublin on June 16, 1904. But he was hell-bent on figuring out what was going on with the distribution of the more than 260,000 words that made up Joyce's novel. With the arrival of the different digital editions of Ulysses, we are again in a position not unlike Ziff with Hanley's index. The data is all there, but what do we do with it? And I don't think anyone will choose to read the XML version over the printed book, at least not as a primary experience. But it's available as a data set for all kinds of quantitative research. Hans-Walter Gabler, Ronan Crowley, and Jonathan Reeve have helped to transform Joyce's written document into a digital one, which means that you don't read Ulysses so much as you search it. And not just words here. There are line and paragraph breaks, quotations, speakers, etc. We used to rely on printed concordances for that kind of research, but even then it was a much different experience. What's unique now, aside from the speed with which you can actually perform these searches, is the general sense that this novel can be turned inside out, rearranged and burrowed through to examine what's inside. And searching doesn't just mean that you read more efficiently, although that's part of it. It describes an entirely new relationship between reader and text. In this digital form, Ulysses is no longer the same object, and you are no longer the same reader. But we also have to factor in the so-called quantitative turn in literary criticism, which also goes under the name of digital humanities or distant reading or computational criticism, whatever. Digitized texts have been around for a few decades now, but there's more of an interest in applying computational methods, the kind that rely on the wider accessibility of digital archives. And so far, the most kind of ambitious experiments with digital text and computational methods have involved distant reading, using tens of thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands of texts to see if we can learn anything new about the laws of the so-called literary universe. The results so far have been pretty mixed, and my own computational work on Ulysses has not quite followed the same course. Instead of throwing Ulysses into a sea of big data, one that erases the specificity and granularity, my own research has been focused more on taking measurements that can be used to think about what's holding this particular novel together, what's behind the design, structure, and proportion that we don't see when we rely only on the words. Instead of distant reading, I've been interested more in a mode of what I'm calling computational close reading. And instead of reducing the bigness of Ulysses by turning it into bytes, that's B-Y-T-E-S, it uses the numbers of Ulysses to think again about the object that the first wave of readers once referred to as the big blue book. The goal is not to arrive at a theory of the novel or of modernism or of word frequency at the beginning of the 20th century. Rather, it's an opportunity to get some basic measurements down so we can continue to examine what Ulysses is and how Ulysses works. So, to get things started, here's one measurement right off the bat. There are, by my count, 592 different characters in the 18 episodes of Ulysses. That sounds simple enough, right? But not exactly. Even a measurement as small as this one requires coming up with categories that can help you decide who or what counts as a character. Martin Cunningham, Simon Dedalus, and Josephine Breen are pretty easy to pin down, but then you also have to consider whether or not you would throw in Patty Dignam, or the Pussons, or Stephen's mother, or Ben Bloom Elijah. In the 592 characters I counted, some of the dead, inanimate and animal, are included. But in sifting through all of the possibilities, I also had to come up with parameters for distinguishing those who speak and those who don't, those who appear in bodily form and those who are mentioned only in passing. Small this data set may be, but simple the interpretation it is not. But it's also a quick lesson about the complexity of literary data and the process of interpretation. Does the question precede the data set, or does it create it? Can you have data without already providing an interpretation? Those are bigger questions that I'm not going to deal with explicitly, but just to kind of keep in mind as we go. This particular data set is comprised of fictional characters who don't exist. But you can also measure the things about Ulysses that are right there in front of you. Its words, its lines, paragraphs, pages are the most obvious examples. Once you begin to think about these units less as inevitabilities in the compositional process, as if Joyce had no choice, and if you think of them in more as possibilities, as if Joyce did have a choice, then things begin to get more interesting. That's one reason to look at the various word counts per episode. That's what you see on the screen now. I just have for the first 13. They're the product of a compromise that took place between the practical limits of publication, which involved the serialization of the first 13 episodes, but also the creative side of the imagination, which doesn't necessarily organize itself by deadlines or material constraints. The 263,000 or so words that make up Ulysses are the result of a gradual process, the one in which Joyce calibrated, and in some cases recalibrated, the length of his individual episodes. There was nothing inevitable, for instance, about the fact that episode 1 would become roughly 7,000 words, or episode 18, roughly 24,000. And as a thought experiment, just try to imagine for a moment what would happen if these two quantities were reversed. Could Molly Bloom even fit into a 7,000 word episode? And how much action, dialogue, or interior monologue would be needed to make episode 1 almost 3-4 times longer? To think of Ulysses as a data set means to participate in a much older hermeneutic activity that interprets a text by taking measurements. Reading for numbers, in other words, to identify and or access what a particular literary work means. It's the kind of philological exercise that critics such as Ernst Robert Curtius relied on for his survey of what he called numerical composition. And he traced it from late antiquity to the Middle Ages in his book on Middle Ages. It's a method that can be traced back to a much older Judeo-Christian practice of theological exegesis, not to mention the Pythagorean premise that the world is organized around a numerical code. Number is everything, the Pythagoreans believed. Everything is number. For the 100 years or so that Ulysses has been around, author and reader have been engaged in a data dance of sorts. Joyce, we've so often been told, has planted all kinds of numbers, and we can set out to find them or simply choose not to care, which many of us do. But you all know what I mean. The 18s, 7s, 8s, and 9s and 3s, the 10s, 11s, 12s, 22s, 28s, and 63s. All these numbers are part of a larger, if incohesive, data set that the author left behind. Some of them embedded in lines or sequences of words, others appearing as quantities that you can count, with a few of them requiring some pretty acrobatic calculations. And so I have a distinct memory here in kind of getting this talk together. I was reminded of an experience I had as an undergraduate in college when Bernard Benstock, who many of you will remember and perhaps knew, came to the class and was talking about episode 10. And what he ended up doing was took out a piece of chalk and he traced a very rough sketch. I wish I had a photograph of it. A rough sketch of Dublin, and he traced the path of Father Conmee and the vice-regal procession to show that in the middle they join an X with Leopold Bloom in the middle, which symbolizes either the Christian cross, the Roman numeral for the episode 10, and the oppression of the Catholic Church in the Roman Empire. And so that was one of my first kind of real, experiences with this kind of reading. And I remember being absolutely blown away and dazzled. I didn't know what the hell you're supposed to do with it, but I thought it was incredibly cool that you could spend your life finding these things inside the actual novel. Now, Hugh Kenner loved to play the data game as well. And his interpretive highlights include the following. The title Ulysses is made up of 7 letters, like the years between 1914 and 1921 on the final page. The 22 words in the first sentence correspond with 2 lines of dactylic hexameter, Homer's meter. And the 62 paragraphs in episode 14 follow a sequence of 11, 40, 11, corresponding with the evolution and egress of the fetus from the womb. His inventiveness is only rivaled by John Kidd, who argued that the pagination and lineation of the entire 1922 edition were part of an elaborate numerological system. Like Kenner, he counted 22 words in the first line, but he took it a step further. He singled out the 14 words in the second line and the 7 words in the third to make the claim that Joyce wanted to direct readers to Psalm 43, which in the King James Version reads as, "Then I will go unto the altar of God," which of course, as we remember with Bach, in Troigo ad altare Dei. But that wasn't all. The 732 pages, Kidd also argued, correspond with the number of days and nights in a leap year, which of course is true of 1904, 366 days times 2, if you can count day and night. But my personal favorite was his pet theory that the 100 paragraphs of episode 3 mirror the 100 cantos of Dante's Commedia. This calculation only works, though, if you count every line of dialogue as a single paragraph. And even then, it's a stretch. Empirical or mystical, real or imagined, doesn't matter. Numbers, we so often notice, are all too often guided by desire. And knowing that they are not true does not necessarily keep us from wondering if they still might be. All of these numbers have been discovered, and skeptics might say invented, to impress friends, fellow critics, family members, and wide-eyed students. But I want to make a simple point here. They are all Joyce's. The critical tradition likes to treat Joyce as the master numerator. He is the one who plugged in the code, and playing his game requires that we accept the rules. Identify, collect, calculate, and then interpret what's been left behind. Understood from this perspective, there's very little interpretive freedom here. The data has already been decoded, and like it or not, it is in fact one more expression of authorial control, bound up with the by now outmoded belief in intentionality. The numbers, in other words, can only mean what Joyce intended them to mean, nothing more, nothing less. But it's also worth noting how much this intention is given a mystical charge, as if the numerically minded author channels the divine, the measurements not so much manufactured as they are intuited or intuited from above. When approaching Ulysses as a data set, those are not the kinds of numbers that I'm after. What's more revealing, I think, are all those far beyond his control, the ones that belong to what I call the numerical unconscious of the novel. And in making this claim, I'm jumping from one critical tradition, the hermeneutic, into another, which for the sake of simplicity, I'll call the quantitative. The hermeneutic tradition tends to treat numbers as symbols. They are meaningful precisely because they signal the presence of some mystical content in the text that cannot be expressed only through the letters and words in a language system. The quantitative, on the other hand, does not read numbers for their symbolic content. They are figures arrived at through acts of counting. And if the hermeneutic treats numbers as deliberate and meaningful, something artists use to organize transcendent worlds, the quantitative approaches them as measurements that provide access to properties of the artistic work that exceed intention. So, by way of an example, and in order to explain how we might continue to think about Ulysses, the dataset, I want to go back to an early moment before this novel was even on the horizon. It was September 1899 when a 17-year-old Joyce visited the Royal Hibernian Academy to set his eyes on a painting by Mihai Muncaci called Ecce Homo. This painting is massive in size, measuring 13 by 21 feet. If you want to use the metric system, that's 403 centimeters by 650 centimeters. And it was the last in a trilogy depicting the moment in which Pontius Pilate presents Jesus Christ to the crowd who gets to decide his fate. People are spread out everywhere, on the balconies, under the porticos, along the staircases. And there's even a particularly cute seated dog, one that the canine-averse Joyce refers to disparagingly as a decrepit street cur who seems oblivious to all the commotion. Everyone knows how this story ends, but what's so striking about Joyce's account and his description of this painting is the way that he mentions almost in passing that there are some 70 figures limned on one canvas. Those of you looking at Ecce Homo at this moment can see that this was not such a simple calculation to perform. The life-size figures in the foreground might be easy enough to pick out, but once you let your eyes wander around the edges of the canvas or linger in the shadows, it can be difficult to know with absolute certainty how many are really there. And that's fitting, given that the ambiguity of the crowd's number is also reflected in the semantic ambiguity of a line that contains 3 puns. The pronoun some, an unspecified amount, is also the noun some, a particular amount. The verb limb, depict or describe, is also the noun limb, an arm or a leg. And figures can signify both a human shape and a number. So the phrase, some 70 figures limned on one canvas, can also be read with the play on the sum of limbs from 70 figures on one canvas. I'm not suggesting that Joyce was thinking of these puns, by the way, but I'm just saying that they're there. So I'm playing around with the semantic, this kind of semantic ambiguity, as I'm calling it, and this kind of numerical ambiguity. Instead of providing an exact number for the figures on Muncaci's crowd, Joyce, we see, prefers an approximation. It's some 70 figures that catch his eye, and not 73, which by all critical accounts, including the one provided in the exhibition catalog that was in circulation at the time, is presented as the correct one. But as casual as Joyce's remark may seem, getting to some 70 means that a calculation had to be performed. Okay. Either way, Joyce was unable to keep track himself, which is possible given the scale when you look at it. But there's another more likely possibility that he was well aware of the precise number from the catalog itself, and he preferred the rough estimate anyway. Whatever the reason, doesn't matter. Some 70 is not just a casual calculation. It's the expression of how a viewer, in this case, Joyce, chooses to perceive the work of art as a data set. Faced with a crowd large enough to overwhelm even the most intrepid spectator, he takes a measurement. There are some 70 figures scattered about, and it's a sum that helps raise the lofty scene to the heights of drama. But here I want to refine the distinction between these two measurements a bit further. Sum 70 is quantitative, by which I mean it's a measurement with an approximate amount. It does not mean anything as a number. 73, on the other hand, is, you could say, hermeneutic. It's not just an exact number for the critics. It's also a symbol that belongs to a system of signification, philosophical, mystical, theological. As casual as Joyce's calculation may seem, sum 70 represents a quantitative reading of Munkachi's canvas. It sees only the number of the crowd, but not the possibility of a deeper meaning. And that symbolic decoding from the number provided by the critics is indeed an option here. 73 is 7 plus 3, or 10, which is 3 squared plus 1. But if you want to take the hermeneutic reading even further, you could subdivide the crowd. And in doing so, discover that there are 9 figures on the stage, including Jesus Christ, or 3 squared, and leaving 64 others, which is 6 plus 4, also 10, or 8 by 8, perfect square. Anyway, all of this is, whatever. These are the games we can play with all of this, right? And you have the idea Joyce chooses sum 70, and then you have the critics at the time choosing 73. And so I spent hours, endless hours, trying to trace any kind of exhibition catalog, because I was like, wait, what is the number? Why do people keep looking for this number? What does the number mean? And of course, then finally, I asked my son I'll show you a silhouette of the crowd at one point, to begin tracing all of the figures. And I knew that there were 9 on the stage, because that's pretty easy to count. And then I just assumed there were 64 more elsewhere in the crowd below the actual stage, only to discover that that's not true. 73 is not only not the exact number of the crowd, it's off by 7 or possibly 8 figures. And if you do the counting, there are 65, maybe 66, maybe 67 if you look at the window and you see a face in the window. But again, this doesn't quite work. But this miscount, I think, is important, right? And it tells us 2 things. There's a critical desire for 73. And I don't know if it came from Munkachi himself, if it came from one of the critics and began to circulate. I have no idea. But it's also interesting that 73 just becomes the number, and then that number just begins to circulate and no one actually does the counting. It also leaves this kind of very interesting ambiguity, which is what I'm going to spend my time talking about today, about like when we're counting, who we're counting, right? Who's there, who's not there. And none of that numerological gaming or the critical miscount really matters here. This is the silhouette of the image without the actual painting, without the paint on it. Whether it's 65, 73, 9 plus 64, Joyce prefers instead the approximation of sum 70. The difference is not simply about downplaying or perhaps ignoring the possibility of the crowd's secret code. Rather, it's a way to emphasize through approximation how Munkachi pulled it off. Back in. All right. Hey, okay. None of that numerological gaming matters or the critical miscount. So I don't want to get too caught up in this. Whether it's 65, 73, 9 plus 64, Joyce prefers the approximation of sum 70. And so the difference is not simply about downplaying or perhaps ignoring the possibility of the crowd's secret code. It's a way to emphasize through approximation how Munkachi pulled it off. When faced with a canvas this large and a subject this lofty, how many figures do you really need to make it all work? And how fine a line is it, say, between the order of the crowd and the chaos of a mob? If you take the hermeneutic approach, Munkachi got there with a mystically charged number. But Joyce still preferred to see an approximate, what I would call realistic one. And to conflate the approximation with realism, I'm actually thinking in particular of Roland Barthes' reality effect. The exact number is not the way we experience reality. And what's more, the quantities in our lives are so often left fuzzy because they don't correspond with lived experience and perception. Sum 70 disregards the numerical interpretation of the artist, preferring instead to emphasize something technical about the structure of the painting. And given the general thrust of Joyce's description of Ecce Homo, that makes perfect sense. The aspect of the artist, he concludes with a very dramatic Nietzschean flourish, is human, intensely, powerfully human. To paint such a crowd, one must probe humanity with no scrupulous knife. That's Joyce at 17. There you go. It's all planted. It's all happening. Before moving on to the crowd of Ulysses, I want to mention one small problem that a strictly hermeneutic reading of Ecce Homo raises. Does Jesus Christ count as 1 or 3? And what about that decrepit street cur, as Joyce calls him, in the courtyard? In the exhibition catalog, 73 is the number for human figures, which means the historical Jesus counts as 1. The dog, and there are actually 2 horses in there, they count as 0. Were you to expand the category of who counts as a character, adding the cur and perhaps the horses, the 73 subdivision no longer works. And that's another reason some 70 is so much more suggestive as a quantity. It actually provides room for this ambiguity. Jesus could be 3, and the dog could be 1. But then there's also some question of who else is lingering in the shadows, those characters who are in the crowd, even if we cannot quite make them out. So, in case you're thinking that I'm taking things a little too far, I perhaps spent way too much time thinking about this painting, I want you to look at this document. It's a character list that Joyce compiled during the writing of episode 15. The cast of characters identified here by their first appearance is by no means complete, but it's evidence of a moment in the composition of the novel when they needed to be quantified. Joyce's list, in other words, is an example of Ulysses the Dataset. The novel boiled down to a quantity that can be measured for a particular interpretive exercise. Now, there's several reasons why Joyce was actually taking inventory of his characters in the summer of 1920. But for now, I just want to stick with the numbers. Each character on this list counts as 1. Joyce, as we see from one calculation, even arrived at the sum of 138 figures, instead of the correct number 140 if you actually do add them all up. It's not a mystical number here, unlike the 153 fish in John, which St. Augustine tells us is the number that we get when we add every number from 1 to 17, which is also 10 plus 7, the 2 holy numbers. But 138 documents how many characters have appeared in the 14 episodes and part of the 5th that had been written and published up until that point. But that's the easy part. Once you have the number, then you have to begin sifting through who makes the cut. Bulson's does not. Jesus, on the other hand, does, counting as 1. But so too do Gary Owen, Socrates, Skin the Goat, and the Crappie Boy. Taken all together then, that's the Son of God, an Irish nationalist canine, an ancient Greek philosopher, an Irish historical figure, and the hero of an Irish ballad. The computational process will not lead you to a mystical beyond, but it does raise a few very categorical questions about who or what counts as a character. Why wouldn't Jesus or Socrates or the Crappie Boy be added? They make numerous appearances in the minds and mouths of the other characters, but even if they never speak a single word themselves. But this rather simple computational act is an opportunity to revisit some basic assumptions we have about what this novel is made of. Put another way, counting character is a way to think about what makes a character count. But sticking with this one example here, I want to recommend that quantifying characters is itself a way to understand the dimensionality of the world Joyce himself was building. Looking at this list is not unlike standing in front of Munkachi's massive canvas. Joyce was coming face to face with the crowd he was in the process of building. Some 140 characters is what he found there, but the interesting thing, of course, is what happened thereafter. Episode 15 is not just one of the most experimental episodes in the novel, or as Franco Moretti calls it, a morphological disaster. It saw the addition of 349 unique characters. So you can see highlighted in this image, all the yellow highlighting from episode 15, those are all the characters in this episode. But once dogs, historical figures, and inanimate objects can count as characters, the possibility for generating new ones expands exponentially. Horses, nymphs, quats, and hoofs are all fair game. But the explosion of unique characters makes sense at this moment in the composition of the novel, and you don't actually need to count in order to notice that the stage is already getting pretty crowded. Should you choose to, however, then you would discover that there's more going on than meets the eye. Out of 445 total characters in episode 15, 96 of them have appeared before. And it's not often the ones that you'd expect. There's the bent hag, Larry O'Rourke and Moses Lugash from episode 4, the postmistress and pug-nosed driver from episode 5, and the blind stripling from episode 8. As with so many of the other small details and symbols, the reappearance of such minor characters is one more way to weave all of the kind of material of the novel together. And these minor characters function rather well as members of an ever-expanding crowd. You really don't know much about them, but you probably recognize them by name, and you might even be able to identify them by a distinctive physical feature: the bent hag, the pug-nosed driver, the blind stripling, and so on. That quantity is worth thinking about further. Episode 15 might be flooded with a cast of new characters, but they're also being joined by a quantity of others who have appeared before. At this moment, then, we are getting some 100 characters. And if you enlarge the scale of the comparison, you discover that this same quantity appears elsewhere in the novel. Stephen, for instance, has 96 characters in his head when walking down Sandymount Strand. There are 106 total characters in the Urban Symphony of episode 10, and then there's 99 non-unique characters in episode 18. Some 100 then is a measurement of a crowd as a sum total and as a refined sample. And if we choose to remember the lesson from Munkachi's canvas, it is what helps raise the drama of the episode itself. And just try to imagine this moment without them, or just throw in the main characters. The plot might not change significantly, but it would disrupt the pacing. It would reduce the scale, which is precisely what is needed to make this scene in the novel not just a kind of return to the repressed, but a collapsing of the past and the present, human and object, dream and reality, significant and insignificant. But there's more. The quantity is not something you'll ever keep track of yourself as you read. It's also something that you feel. As readers, we navigate the crowd, sometimes passing by all the names with our heads down, noticing some and not others, but there's a consistency to it all, which is what the computational process reveals. We don't read the crowd for its numbers, and Joyce didn't write it that way. Still, there's a side to the creative process requiring that limits get established. Like any composer or any painter with a canvas, no matter how large, Joyce was tasked with figuring out how many can fit. And in this case, the crowd was a quantity that got discovered gradually. It began to take shape once the technique of interior monologue really kicked in with episode 3. Then it took off once Leopold Bloom began to wander the streets of Dublin, only to culminate with Molly's dramatic monologue. In Ulysses, the quantity of the crowd was a practical problem that needed to be solved. And you could imagine other solutions. Stephen with half that number of characters in his head, or Dublin double the size in episode 10. And yet that's not what happens. During the process of writing the novel, some 100 becomes a quantity for the crowd that, quote, feels right. There's no mysticism behind it, much like there's no authorial intention. But that doesn't mean we should not be aware that the quantity is there. It's part of the material expression of the novel's form, something that provides depth and proportionality, working within the time and space of the plot to make the world of this novel come to life. But there's one more point I want to make here. The quantity of the crowd in Ulysses is not restricted only to those characters who walk around the streets of Dublin. As I just mentioned, it can also exist in the heads of the 3 major characters. We celebrate interior monologue for its capacity to bring thoughts, feelings, memories, desires of characters to us in an unmediated way. But let's not forget that it was also an incredibly convenient tool for generating expansive character networks on a scale that was unprecedented in the history of the novel. And in this case, the crowded networks in the minds of Stephen, Bloom, and Molly required bending time and space, allowing for the circulation of characters who were not, strictly speaking, present. In addition, and as seen with Stephen's mother, Bloom's son and father, and Molly's lovers, it could also include those who are no longer among the living. Which brings us to what is arguably the most fascinating crowd in the entire novel, the one in Molly Bloom's head. We may never see Molly wandering around Dublin, but her network, we soon discover, is expansive and very much alive. Lying in bed, with a sleeping spouse by her side, she's free to conjure up all kinds of characters from the present, but she mixes them in with a catalog of others from earlier periods of her life. In practical terms, the movement of characters back and forth across time and space is really what helps round out Molly Bloom. Her network, in fact, adds up to 284 total characters. And if earlier I mentioned the non-unique ones, the Sum 100, here instead, I want to say a few words about the 185 who only appear in episode 18. To do so, I'll pose a simple question. Where did that quantity come from? Joyce began Ulysses with a few characters hanging out in and around the Martello Tower, but throughout the course of writing the novel, he soon realizes that there are different kinds of crowds he can work with, the ones who belong to the external world and the ones that circulate in mind only. Though he may have begun with the idea that a character has to exist in bodily form to be there, he ends with a demonstration of just how unnecessary bodies are. Crowded minds, it turns out, can be as effective as crowded streets. And here's an obvious point. There is no Molly Bloom without the crowd. Her character, in fact, depends on it. And if Sum 100 helps connect her with all those characters we've seen and heard throughout the day, the 185 appearing in the wee hours of June 17th belong to her alone. They include all those people from her childhood in Gibraltar, but also from the books she reads, the historical figures she's heard about, and the old neighbors whose names she'll never quite remember. 187 is double that of Stephen's crowd in episode 3, when he gets to think in peace. But it's closer in quantity to the 208 characters in episode 8, when Bloom is more or less left by himself. Molly Bloom is not one character, she is many. And to borrow a line from Gilles Deleuze, who prefers actually Mrs. Dalloway to Molly Bloom, it would be more precise to say in his words that Molly is fully a part of the crowd and at the same time completely outside it, removed from it. And this is not just a philosophical assertion or metaphysical conceit. It's something we have a measurement for. We see her in the crowd, Sum 100, and outside of it with Sum 180. The point, finally, is that the measurement doesn't really matter on its own. The interpretation, however, does. The process of abstracting this novel can help us address questions about scale and design that are rather different from the ones that we have available to us already. In the process of counting character, the goal was not to pin down the exact number or fetishize it and just say that that number's there, let's not think about it anymore. The data itself was always a challenge since it required the constant questioning of categories, the kinds that you use to organize and redefine the object of inquiry. If anything, this exercise is not intended to generate definitive results that can be stored away and forgotten. Rather, it's there to provide basic measurements that help us understand how Ulysses actually happened, why it assumed the shape that it did, how it continues to generate certain effects on readers and not others. Dublin, as we know, is as much a product of words as it is of data. The challenge, of course, is figuring out how to count one without losing sight of the other. So with the few minutes I've left, 2 quick minutes, 3 minutes. With the few minutes I have left, I just want to zoom out a bit and make an observation or two about computational literary analysis more generally and Ulysses more specifically. First, the more general point. As I argued today, the quantitative approach is not opposed to qualitative criticism. In fact, it's precisely quantitative measurements that challenge us to think through some basic qualitative problems, counting character, in other words, to understand what makes a character count. But in saying that, though, I don't want to give the false impression that the quantitative came first, or that Ulysses is valuable insofar as it gives us data that can be used to test computational methods. Quite the opposite is true. The qualitative dimension of character cannot be fully understood without running the numbers. In fact, it's precisely by working with the data that we can address the more complex ontological, ethical, historical, and political questions that the novel asks about characters in groups and in isolation over the course of 18 episodes. So it's through the data that we also get to see Ulysses as a dynamic organism, one that evolves over time with a sense of proportion that can be measured and known. I mean, that's what you see in this last slide that I'm giving you for today. You're watching, from episode 1 to episode 18, this novel, which we know as words and pages, begin to assume this kind of abstract shape, but you're watching a kind of the growth of it in a way that you're not accustomed to seeing. And I think that helps you think about kind of what this thing is, kind of how it takes shape. I don't want to get too far right now, but just to say that there is a quality to it of a kind of the genetic side of the novel that we get to see through this kind of process of gathering, collecting, and visualizing data that's often hidden from us. But taking that question about character count seriously, as I did for today, necessarily leads us to think more about the size of the crowd in the city, but also the nature of novelistic social networks as they develop in relation to memory, the imagination, and the unconscious. So in closing, I just want to add one more thing. The counting in Ulysses is in progress before we even get there. In fact, the novel seems to anticipate, even as it sometimes mocks, our reliance on quantitative approaches for interpretation, as if it knows before we do that there's something else behind all the words. Is it a surprise then to discover Bloom counting the heads of his fellow mourners, or counting the notes as he listens to music at the Ormond Hotel, or counting the minutes before his wife's adulterous encounter, or the pebbles on the beach as he lingers around after sunset to avoid going home? In each case, counting is a process and a practice, something you do to find out, as Bloom himself says, if this is equal to that. But the goal, I think, is to remember that seeing the world as data does not ruin lived and imagined experience. Quite the opposite. It can enhance the wonder of what's around you, and being able to count the people, the pebbles, the minutes, and the musical notes might help you discover aspects of life and living you never knew were there. And that includes, of course, the books you read and all of the characters that you'll never remember. Thank you.